Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the screening of Blade Runner, and I hope you enjoyed the curator remarks I've already done. But like I said in that intro, I wasn't completely satisfied with the way that I covered, this whole film. And because of the nature of the way that those curator remarks are done, it doesn't always give us the room to discuss things that happen in the movie that would be spoilers otherwise. And so I finally want to engage in some dialogue about a particular scene. But I didn't want to do that alone because I think, you already get enough of my opinion. And so I decided to invite one of my friends, one of our Movie Club correspondents, to, join me in this discussion because I think it's very important to have as many different perspectives on this particular scene as possible. I realized that if I wanted to do this right, I needed to utilize someone else's perspective. Someone whose perspective might actually be really helpful to unearth, I think, something that's very important to discuss about this particular scene from what is otherwise a very classic movie. And that is why I brought in, for the first time, one of our Movie Club correspondents, my good friend Natasha Anderson, to talk about this particular scene and how it impacts our enjoyment of the film and how we interpret it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha to introduce herself and to tell you a little bit about what we're going to be discussing tonight.
Hey Movie Club, thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to talk about Blade Runner, a film that is actually pretty new to me. So thank you, Patrick, for having me. I look forward to being among your ranks when my schedule is not as crazy. But yeah, Blade Runner. I hope you all enjoyed the film. I certainly enjoyed my first viewing of it, but that is to say that there was something very peculiar to me, specifically one scene, and I'm sure by now we've all seen it and we're all thinking about it and challenging it, but yeah, something that has been deemed a love scene, which I would disagree with. But going into my first watch, I was not familiar with it at all. I didn't know it was coming, and so when I was watching this film that everyone praises so highly, I mean, visually it's amazing and definitely ahead of its time, I was shocked to come upon something that was very uncomfortable and upsetting in a lot of ways. And then it was almost like it never happened. And so that was very challenging to me as a viewer and an audience member and as a woman. And yeah, I'm excited to dive into a few of those thoughts that I have. I'd love to hear what you guys are saying, and yeah, I hope at least it prompts some good dialogue.
Absolutely. And I think just to open up tonight's discussion, a great starting point would be there are quite a few different interpretations of the scene, which I'm sure you're aware of. But I think I'm most interested in how do you feel when you watch this scene?
So as I said earlier, I had not seen Blade Runner until about a month and a half ago. And it had been on my watch list forever because it's one of the greats. It's one of the movies I studied in my film classes. It is one of those that people are constantly talking about how it was ahead of its time or just amazing for what it is. And so going into it, I was really excited and eager to read the film and have it live up to everyone's expectations. So it was very challenging to me when I got to the love scene, as critics and viewers have called it, and it wasn't a love scene, it was a rape scene. And that was hard for me to reckon with, as no one had ever really talked about it before. Granted, I know people are talking about it, but it was nothing that I read in any of the major reviews or critiques of the film when I was first going into it. And so that was very shocking. And it makes me wonder, was it not important enough to be talked about? Are we too uncomfortable to talk about it? But it was hard. It was hard to confront that. And I think it's challenging for me to look back and wonder what the point of the film is. On one hand, it's a rape. It's clearly, like, it's not subtle, like you know what it is. But on the other hand, the framing of the film, and specifically in that scene, is very challenging to reckon with. There's dim lighting, there's Harrison Ford shirtless on the couch, there's a saxophone playing, And so what should be a sense of, I don't know if I would say horror, but tension, building tension up to the violation in the scene, it's building something that's seductive, it's tempting, something that's enticing. And so that was very hard for me to, think it's going to be this like coming together of two characters, but it was actually something way worse. And so when I wonder what the point of the scene is, where my thought process has landed has been, you think it's going to be this really great thing, but it's not. And, we have a replicant and a human. And I think Deckard's character just shows the fallibility of humanity. And I think, one of the overarching questions of the film is, what does it mean to be human? And so I think it means that we're fallible. And so in that scene, I hate how they went about it, but for him, that was that he's still flawed. He's still going to take advantage.
Right. And I guess by extension of that, what do you think is the point of the scene? What does it serve to, what function does it serve for the larger story? Or I guess in a simpler way to put that is, why do you think this scene is in the movie, and does it, do anything for the story other than making people uncomfortable?
Yes, great question. There are many different interpretations, and honestly some that I would agree with, but I think for me where I've landed to reckon with the film and make sense of it, specifically in regards to this scene, is that at the end of the day, Deckard is human, and to be human is to be fallible. And so while the scene is building to be this romance and this coming together of two people, it ends in tragedy and violation and destruction. And whatever care Deckard had for Rachel as a replicant was thrown out the window. And so that's really disappointing, because you want it to be one thing, but at the end of the day, he was always going to be broken and fallible. And of course, he took advantage of Rachel, which I think comes to show that like he never truly cared about her to begin with, and that she is a means to an end, which is very disappointing, because after this scene, Rachel is pretty much left out of the rest of the narrative. I mean, she's there in dialogue from others, but she's pretty much absent, which to me only further conveys the idea of that she was only here to fulfill one thing, and that thing was to satisfy Deckard. And that's very disappointing, because I think that reinforces the idea that women are sexual beings, but not in their own sense, but for men. And so I think that's really disappointing. And so that's kind of where I have landed with that scene, coming to terms with myself. But I understand that other people have other interpretations of it.
Right, and I think this opens up the floor for, I think, a very important discussion on like how masculinity is represented in cinema, because I do think, at least one of my beliefs is that movies have the power, stories have the power to change the world. And so if the lessons that we're teaching men through the films that they're consuming with their fathers, because those are the movies that their fathers took them to see, those are the stories that are telling young men what masculinity is, what they should be doing. And I guess it's disappointing to me that this is the way I think that very toxic masculinity is represented right here in this very scene that we're discussing. And not only is it incredibly distressing, even for me, that this is still the dominant view of what men should be in modern society, but it's also disheartening to see how prevalent it was during the 80s and even throughout Ford's career.
With all of that said, I do think it's very disappointing that the idea in picture and honestly caricature of masculinity is reinforced through this film. And granted, I know it was the 80s, I know it was a while ago, But I also don't think that's a good enough excuse anymore as to why we say men can only be angry and macho and they can take advantage of things and people in position, and that's okay because it's just how it was. So I think it's disappointing that that is the view we get here, and there could have been a great narrative with Rachel and Deckard, but there just wasn't, which I think is challenging when it comes to the second film, but we'll leave that for another day. But it's disappointing because that same caricature of masculinity is still very much seen today. I think we're beginning to confront that, and especially in art and the media, but it's still very much men don't cry, men can only be angry, and we let men get away with things because they're promising young men, and we're tired. That's a little bit of a soapbox, but I think you can look back through Harrison Ford's career and see that in a lot of different roles. I mean, there's a scene in Star Wars when Han Solo kisses Leia, and it's a little questionable about whether or not she wanted that. And so I think, in a way, that image has been married to Ford, and it's carried him through different roles, which would be a great character study to go through all of his characters and just see what does it look like with the traditional lens of masculinity. So I'm hoping, and it would be very exciting to see him in roles more modern, more evolved. Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Additionally, though, I think this view of masculinity is really sad because it's limiting in what we give men. We don't allow them the space to have their emotions and to show a softer side or a caring side, which, not to say that those aren't there, but we don't allow that. So I would love if we just collectively would push against the idea of masculinity in our modern society.
And I guess to follow that up, it's like, how does this scene affect how you view Deckard? Like, does it change your opinion of him? I assume it does. But like, where do you start with your feelings on Deckard, and does this, challenge what you thought Deckard was through this scene?
This would be really interesting to hear what all of you guys have to say, so I don't know, put them somewhere so I can find them. But I think this scene reinforces my expectations of Deckard. Not necessarily of Deckard as Deckard, but Deckard as a man, which is really sad to say. I wanted to believe that he would be the guy to come and save the day and do it in a way of respect and justice and just nothing flawed. But in the end, he was the guy who fell in love with Rachel but really took advantage of her. So it was kind of like, okay, great. So like, you're seeking out justice, but how is justice met here? It wasn't. And so I don't know, it's very disappointing. I said earlier, it's also hard to reckon with his character in the first Blade Runner versus the second, which is a whole other conversation for another day. But I think it just shows that Deckard is human, and to be human means to fail. And he failed in a really big personal way in this scene, which is very disappointing. But I think it takes away his credibility, because, I mean, he's a Blade Runner. What is credibility in that realm? But also, you're rooting for him as an audience member. You want to be on his team. Like, you want him to solve the case. But what is he doing when he's not being the Blade Runner? He's in his apartment with dim lighting, and really unfortunate, sketchy things happen. And you don't want that. And so I think he lived up to my expectations, but the expectations I didn't want to have.
Absolutely. I guess just spinning out on that discussion from on nostalgia, and specifically how masculinity is represented in things that we're nostalgic for. What do you think when we make shows built on that kind of nostalgia for this era, like Stranger Things? How do we represent this type of trope without, descending into just passively accepting it? Is there something that we can do through the way that we tell stories that we can condemn it and then try and move on, or are we kind of doomed to repeat that cycle if we don't address it at all?
One of the reasons I think Blade Runner is so beloved to many people is the nostalgia of it. A lot of people watched it when they were kids. It was groundbreaking for its time. It's an exciting story, and it takes LA, but it gives it to you in a whole new way, an LA you've never seen before, and that's exciting for people. Nostalgia is sweet, and it's comforting, and it gives you the space to imagine who you were at that time, or the imagination to think of what it would have been like at this time. And I think we're seeing nostalgia heavily at play in modern media, whether that be cinema or television. Take Stranger Things, for example. We all love Stranger Things, and part of the reason we love it is because you are put into the 80s, and for our parents, it's like, oh my gosh, that kid was me. Or for people who are younger, we can say, oh my gosh, I love that music. Or, wow, how fun would it be to like ride around on bikes and sweaters with our friends? There's a certain element that's really exciting, and it's new and it's fascinating, and you get to jump into a world that you were a part of at one time, or something that's altogether new for you. And so I think nostalgia is highly effective. Not in the Disney live action remakes, if you ask me, but that's a soapbox I won't get on. I think it's effective in painting a world that is already familiar to us. And so it's difficult when people love Blade Runner and it's their favorite movie and it's amazing and it's got almost 5 stars in everything, but there's things we have to reckon with. And so I think it's difficult to, ask ourselves what is like entertainment and shock factor versus good storytelling. And there's not a clear-cut answer to that. It's very gray. But I think a lot of things in film are used because it's shocking, which we then equate to entertainment. But in reality, was it good storytelling? And I think we can ask ourselves that with this scene in Blade Runner. Was a rape necessary? No, I think we could have done things in the story more effectively, or we could have framed it different, or we could have given the audience, something else, something that wasn't unfortunate and uncomfortable, and something we had to reckon with. And that's not to say we want to take away from the story itself. It's just, was this the best way we could have gone about this? And that's a hard question to ask ourselves, because you can do that with any film, but I think nostalgia can be built in other ways, whether that be the music or the set or the design. I just lean into all those other creative elements when it comes to a film, rather than say, we're going to do this one thing that may not be effective, but it will be shocking, and that'll get buzz and attention and conversation, when it's like, that can actually be really triggering and bad for people. So I don't know. I think that's something as artists we'll just have to reckon with.
Right. And I assume that you feel the same way, but one of the things that bothers me the most about a lot of media is that so often is that like women are utilized as being like these damsels in distress for the hero to go after, and then once they satisfy a particular story beat, they're absent from the rest of the narrative. And sadly, Blade Runner is, a part of that. And it's kind of sad how unique and interesting of a character that Rachel seems in like that first half, and then after the scene she just disappears until the end of the movie, effectively just dismissed from the narrative after the scene of violation, that there's nothing more for her character to do other than pop back up at the end of the film. But even that doesn't really satisfy any particular narrative beat, and it just makes me realize like, oh, her character really didn't serve a whole purpose other than, just like you said, satisfying that one need for Ford's Deckard.
So, as we mentioned earlier, after the rape, Rachel's pretty much gone. I mean, several of the other characters talk about her, and, there's warnings made about her, threats made about her, but in the end, none of it's coming from Rachel. Rachel is out of there, which to me is really sad, because while she was a replicant and her memories weren't real, she was very much posed as a real woman. And to say that she was only good up until Deckard got what he wanted, which was sexual pleasure, is really disheartening, because how cheap and how old is that narrative? So I think getting to the end and confronting that ending didn't really change anything about how I felt about the movie and that scene after the scene. It was really disappointing. I think even with the rape, the filmmakers and the storytellers wanted you to still believe in this big love story and this grand thing between Deckard and Rachel, and it's Romeo and Juliet, but it was just disappointing, and I didn't believe it, and it felt like a way to justify what had happened, and yeah, it didn't change anything for me, so I don't know, it was just disappointing.
Right, and I guess if I had to toil that out just a little bit more, I wonder if there's any additional, interpretations of both the full text or just that one scene that either could alter, the way that we view Deckard's character, or, whether or not we're just kind of doomed to deal with the moral grayness, the moral ambiguity of his character, especially after this really dark and horrific act in this scene that mars what is otherwise, I think, a complex, but, at least a pretty good person. I think this film, muddies the water, and I wonder if part of that has to do with the genre that we're dealing with, the fact that it's a film noir set in the future, so a new neo-noir, and if that has to do with the choice to do this, to, pull us away from being able to deal with, like, oh, I like this character, they're good, they're just doing a couple bad things that I wouldn't agree with, but instead giving us something that's much more complex and makes it, much harder to root for them, or root for really anyone, because in all honesty, there's not a hero in this film. Deckard barely satisfies the qualifications for that, and this scene really makes it messy to classify him that way.
All of that to say, there are many interpretations of Blade Runner. You can fall in this category, you can fall in this category, you can stand here in the middle and believe either one, but also there's all these other categories everywhere, and opinions and perspectives, and I think any good piece of art or cinema, film, it challenges you, and it challenges you to go explore more and want to know more and to get with others and hear their perspectives. And so to me, Blade Runner is effective because while there is a piece of it that I really don't love, it challenged me and it got me thinking, and I asked questions, and I went out and searched for different perspectives, and I do think any good piece of film should do that. And so Ridley Scott, good job, you got me there. But I do think Blade Runner is worth a watch, and yeah, it raises great questions, but it's really fun up until that controversial scene, and the second Blade Runner is incredible. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend. But yeah, I hope some of these thoughts have been helpful. I was very honored to be asked to share some of my thoughts. Yeah, my perspective is not the only one, and so I would encourage you to challenge what I say, go seek out another perspective, and go watch the movie for yourself if you haven't. It's a masterclass in many ways, but yeah, I hope this was helpful, but thanks for having me, and keep watching those movies. Bye, guys.
Thank you once again to Natasha for joining us for this incredible discussion on a fantastic film, Blade Runner. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I don't know what we're going to be covering next time on Post Credits, but if you have a suggestion for a film, a scene, a moment, something that you think is important from either a film that we've covered or a film that we haven't covered yet, but maybe you want us to cover, leave it in the description or the comments down below, and we'll try and address it at some point. Either Natasha will be back to discuss that with me, or we'll bring in another correspondent. I don't know. I don't really plan these things in advance, but I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I hope you got something out of it, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. For all of us here at Movie Club and the Post Credits podcast, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and we'll see you all again very, very soon.